More than 4.5 billion years ago, the Earth was an alien world, unlike anything we recognize today. There were no skies of blue, no oceans sparkling with life, and certainly no plants, animals, or humans. The planet was young, molten, and violent, a sphere of searing rock surrounded by a dense and poisonous atmosphere. Its surface glowed with rivers of lava, while volcanoes erupted continuously, sending ash and gas high into the sky. Storms raged across the globe, ignited by constant lightning strikes that illuminated the dark, turbulent clouds above. In this primordial environment, even the fundamental forces of nature seemed to act with unchecked intensity, shaping a world of chaos and raw energy. During these earliest days, Earth was recovering from one of the most catastrophic events in its history, a collision with a Mars-sized body named Theia. The impact was so intense that it ejected vast quantities of molten rock into orbit around the young planet. Over time, these fragments coalesced to form the Moon, which would go on to stabilize Earth's rotation and tides, playing a critical role in shaping the future of life. But the aftermath left the planet in a state of extreme instability. Temperatures at the surface exceeded 1,000 degrees Celsius, and the oceans were oceans of molten rock, impossible for any life to survive. Yet, even in this infernal landscape, the seeds of life were quietly gathering. As the planet gradually cooled over millions of years, a thin crust began to form, fragile and broken, constantly reshaped by volcanic activity and frequent meteorite impacts. Small impacts continued to batter the planet, melting sections of the crust and blasting material into the atmosphere, but the intervals between these collisions slowly lengthened. This allowed the surface to stabilize enough to support the condensation of water vapor. Volcanic outgassing had filled the atmosphere with steam, carbon dioxide, nitrogen, methane, and other gases, creating conditions that were hostile to any complex life but perfect for chemistry to experiment. At last, the first rains fell. Not gentle showers, but relentless torrents that persisted for thousands, perhaps millions of years. These rains filled the planet's lowlands and craters, forming shallow pools and eventually the earliest oceans. These primordial seas were not the tranquil, clear blue waters familiar to us. They were dark, warm, and rich in dissolved minerals, iron, sulfur, magnesium, and countless other elements released from the planet's molten interior. This mineral-rich soup became the arena where chemistry could begin to organize itself. Where molecules could meet, interact, and combine in countless ways, the sun, young and volatile, bombarded the surface with high-energy ultraviolet radiation. Lightning streaked across stormy skies, and hydrothermal vents along the ocean floor released superheated, mineral-laden fluids into the surrounding water. Volcanoes heated shallow pools, while tidal forces from the nearby moon churned the oceans. Every source of energy, from light to heat to electrical discharge, drove reactions among the simplest molecules, creating increasingly complex chains of organic compounds. Amino acids, nucleotides, lipids, and sugars began to form. Some molecules collided and formed bonds, others broke apart under energy bombardment, only to collide again. Chaos, repeated over eons, began producing order. Among these chemical experiments, lipid molecules naturally formed tiny spherical bubbles in water, enclosing themselves in a membrane-like structure. These bubbles, called protocells, were not alive but provided a protected microenvironment for reactions to occur more efficiently than in the open ocean. They trapped molecules inside, allowing concentration and stability where chemical complexity could increase. Meanwhile, strands of RNA began to appear. RNA is a unique molecule. It can both store information, like a primitive code, and catalyze reactions, acting as an enzyme. At first, RNA molecules were fragile, breaking apart easily, but some survived long enough to copy small parts of themselves. Errors in replication created variation. Some RNA molecules folded into stable configurations, some catalyzed reactions that helped them replicate, and a few became slightly more efficient at surviving in the harsh primordial oceans. Over countless cycles, these variations were filtered by natural selection, long before cells, tissues, or organisms existed. Some RNA strands found themselves within lipid membranes, creating a primitive association of molecule and container. These early protocells could grow by absorbing molecules from the surrounding soup, and eventually divide when they became too large, passing copies of their RNA to daughter protocells. This process marked the birth of life as we define it, entities capable of growth, replication, and evolution. These first living cells were simple, single-celled organisms resembling modern archaea or bacteria. They had no nucleus, no organelles, no awareness. Yet they thrived in the warm, nutrient-rich oceans, feeding on simple chemicals, and releasing byproducts that slowly altered the chemistry of their environment. Life was beginning to shape Earth even as Earth had shaped life. For millions of years, the world was a microbial ocean. Microorganisms floated in water, clung to surfaces near hydrothermal vents, or formed thin films on the seafloor. Evolution at this microscopic scale drove diversity. Some microbes developed pigments capable of absorbing sunlight, performing early photosynthesis that did not yet produce oxygen. Others optimized chemical metabolism, extracting energy from sulfur, hydrogen, or methane. These primitive metabolic pathways laid the foundation for the great transformations of life yet to come. Around 2.7 billion years ago, a revolutionary breakthrough occurred. Cyanobacteria-like organisms developed the ability to split water molecules during photosynthesis, releasing oxygen as a byproduct. Initially, oxygen reacted with abundant iron in the oceans, forming rust deposits on the seafloor. Eventually, oxygen accumulated in the atmosphere, creating the conditions for the Great Oxidation event. Oxygen was toxic to many existing microbes, causing widespread die-offs, but it provided an incredibly rich energy source for those that could harness it. Cells adapted, evolving new metabolic pathways and increasing in complexity. Some single-celled organisms began engulfing others, forming symbiotic relationships that would later become the mitochondria in complex eukaryotic cells. This leap in cellular complexity set the stage for multicellular life, enabling specialization, cooperation, and eventually the evolution of plants, animals, and all higher forms of life. Throughout this time, the Earth itself was transformed. The atmosphere changed from a toxic mix of gases to one containing oxygen. Oceans were enriched with minerals, light, and chemical gradients. Continents emerged, rivers carved valleys, and the climate stabilized enough to support more complex ecosystems. All of this, forests, oceans, fish, birds, mammals, and humans, traced its lineage back to a single microscopic protocell, floating in a dark, mineral-rich ocean billions of years ago. Life had begun in chaos, in heat, storms, lightning, and chemical fury. It was fragile, minute, and entirely unaware of its potential. Yet that first cell initiated a chain of events that would ultimately lead to consciousness, culture, technology, and civilization. From a chemical reaction in a violent, young world emerged every living thing that has ever existed, and all that is yet to come. The story of life on Earth begins not with grandeur or design, but with a simple spark in the depths of an ancient ocean, a spark that replicated, adapted, and endured. And from that spark, everything we know and cherish would one day arise. For hundreds of millions of years after the first protocells emerged in Earth's ancient oceans, life existed only at the microscopic scale. There were no plants, no animals, no sound of movement, only an invisible world of single-celled organisms drifting through the dark waters or clinging to mineral surfaces at the bottom of the sea. And yet, in this silent era, life was quietly building the foundations for everything that would follow. It was an age defined not by grand, visible creatures, but by chemistry, evolution, and the slow accumulation of complexity. In those early oceans, the Earth was still a dangerous place. Asteroid impacts, though less frequent than before, still scarred the surface. Volcanoes erupted constantly, releasing clouds of dust and gases that cast temporary shadows over the world. The atmosphere, thick with methane, carbon dioxide, and nitrogen, allowed sunlight to reach the oceans but filtered it through a hazy sky. The seas themselves contained dissolved iron that gave them a deep, dark, almost blood-red appearance. Yet beneath the churning waves, life had found its foothold. The first true cells, simple prokaryotes resembling modern bacteria and archaea, were masters of survival. They fed on the chemical richness of the early Earth, extracting energy from sulfur, hydrogen, iron, and methane. Some thrived around hydrothermal vents, where superheated fluids poured from the crust. Others lived in the more moderate shallows, where sunlight filtered through the surface. Each environment favored different chemical pathways, encouraging cells to diversify. And over time, evolution shaped countless variations, each adapted to a specific niche. This microscopic world operated on principles far removed from the complexities of later life. Cells reproduced by dividing, splitting themselves into copies. Mutations, though rare compared to today, introduced occasional variations, and natural selection filtered these differences. Some organisms became better at processing sulfur, others at absorbing minerals, others at surviving high temperature or acidity. Gradually, ecosystems of microbes formed, webs of chemical dependency in which the waste product of one species became the food source of another. Among these microbial pioneers, a revolutionary innovation began to evolve: photosynthesis. The earliest forms of photosynthesis did not produce oxygen. Instead, they captured sunlight using pigments and converted simple molecules like hydrogen sulfide into energy. These anoxygenic photosynthesizers spread through the shallow seas, forming vast communities that turned sunlight into chemical energy with increasing efficiency. Yet the real transformation came with the emergence of cyanobacteria, capable of splitting water molecules to extract electrons, a process that released oxygen as a byproduct. At first, this oxygen was absorbed by iron dissolved in the oceans, forming rust that sank to the seafloor. Over millions of years, thick layers of iron oxide accumulated, now preserved in ancient banded iron formations found in rocks worldwide. These formations are silent witnesses to one of the greatest chemical shifts in Earth's history, but once the iron was exhausted, oxygen began to accumulate in the atmosphere. Slowly, and then more rapidly, oxygen transformed the world. It reacted with methane, reducing greenhouse warming and triggering climatic cooling. It created a protective ozone layer that shielded the surface from harmful ultraviolet radiation. And it introduced an entirely new challenge to living organisms: oxygen was toxic. Many early microbes died in this new atmosphere, unable to tolerate oxygen's reactive properties. Others retreated into oxygen-free environments, deep sediments, hydrothermal vents, and dark, stagnant waters. But some adapted. They evolved enzymes to neutralize oxygen's reactive byproducts, and eventually learned to use oxygen itself as an energy source. This innovation, aerobic respiration, was far more efficient than anaerobic metabolism and allowed cells to extract vastly more energy from the same nutrients. Energy abundance gave rise to complexity. In the oceans, some single-celled organisms began engulfing other cells, not as prey, but as partners. A smaller cell capable of using oxygen for energy became trapped inside a larger host. And over time, the two became inseparable. The smaller cell evolved into a mitochondrion, the powerhouse of modern eukaryotic cells. This event, known as endosymbiosis, was one of the most important transformations in the history of life. It marked the birth of complex cells, cells with internal structures, cytoskeletons, and greater capacity for growth. These eukaryotic cells were larger, more flexible, and more capable than the prokaryotes that preceded them. Their internal membranes created compartments for specialized reactions. Their DNA was organized into a nucleus, protected from the harsh chemicals of the cytoplasm. This structure allowed for more precise regulation of genes and more sophisticated response to environmental changes. As millions of years passed, eukaryotes diversified. Some evolved into ancestors of algae, forming the world's first true plankton. Others developed the ability to move using flexible filaments, allowing them to swim through water. Still others engaged in a second great endosymbiotic event, engulfing photosynthetic bacteria that eventually became chloroplasts, the structures responsible for plant photosynthesis. These chloroplast-bearing cells were ancestors of all plants and algae. During this time, Earth experienced dramatic climate fluctuations. One of the most extreme events, known as the snowball Earth, may have occurred multiple times. Vast ice sheets spread from the poles toward the equator. The oceans froze near the surface, trapping life beneath layers of ice. Yet in the darkness and cold, life persisted. Hydrothermal vents continued to provide heat and nutrients. Subglacial oceans remained liquid, and microbial communities adapted to the extreme conditions. Oxygen remained in the atmosphere, and the planet never fully lost the chemical groundwork for future biological expansion. When the ice finally retreated, sunlight returned to the oceans, and life celebrated with an explosion of diversity. Algae spread through the seas, capturing sunlight more efficiently than ever before. Eukaryotic cells formed colonies, cooperating for defense, feeding, or reproduction. Some colonies became more specialized, with individual cells evolving into distinct roles, an early precursor to true multicellularity. This shift from single-celled existence to coordinated multicellular life was not instantaneous. It was a gradual dance of evolution, driven by the advantages of size, cooperation, and specialization. Larger groups were harder for predators to consume. Specialized cells improved efficiency. And as gene regulation systems became more refined, multicellular organisms became stable. Self-replicating units. Still, for most of Earth's early history, the planet remained overwhelmingly microbial. Microbes shaped the air we breathe, the chemistry of the oceans, and even the temperature of the planet. They cycled nutrients, built stromatolites, layered structures still found in some coastal areas today, and created vast mats on ancient seafloors. Though invisible to the naked eye, these organisms were engineers of the global environment. They set the stage for the rise of plants, animals, and ultimately humans. Without billions of years of microbial innovation, photosynthesis, respiration, endosymbiosis, multicellularity, none of the later chapters of life would have been possible. By the end of this silent microbial age, the world had been transformed. Oxygen had filled the sky. Oceans had become home to diverse eukaryotic communities. The climate, though still dynamic, had stabilized enough to support more complex ecosystems. The stage was set for a leap forward, one that would finally bring visible life into the world. Soon, the oceans would awaken with new shapes, new behaviors, and new strategies for survival. Life was ready to take its first steps toward size, complexity, and the dazzling variety we now recognize on Earth. But before the first animals, before the first plants, and long before the first humans, everything depended on this long, quiet era of microscopic evolution. The next chapter would not be silent. It would be an explosion, a burst of creativity unlike anything the world had yet seen. As Earth continued its slow transformation from a planet ruled entirely by microbes into a world of increasing biological potential, the stage was quietly being set for one of the most dramatic events in the history of life. But before this great burst of creativity could occur, evolution had to solve several monumental challenges. It had to master cooperation among cells, develop the first tissues, invent the first body plans, and overcome the environmental limits of a still-changing planet. The story of life's journey from simple colonies to complex multicellular organisms is one of perseverance, innovation, and the relentless pressure of natural selection. The first multicellular organisms did not resemble plants or animals as we know them today. They were soft, fragile, and microscopic, made of loosely connected cells that communicated chemically. These early communities resembled thin films or jelly-like clusters drifting through oceans rich with nutrients and sunlight. While simple, these clusters represented a crucial idea, that multiple cells could work together more effectively than a single cell alone. For billions of years, life had existed as individual cells. Now, evolution had begun experimenting with unity. Cells within a group began to specialize. Some focused on capturing energy, others on reproduction, and others on structural support. Specialization required communication. Chemical signals acted as primitive messages, instructing cells when to divide, when to change shape, or when to break away. Over time, these signals became more refined. Clusters became structured. Tissues began to form. And in those quiet evolutionary experiments, the blueprint for complex life was being drafted. Earth's oceans, meanwhile, were stabilizing. Oxygen levels, once dangerously low, were gradually rising. Though still far below modern levels, the increase allowed new metabolic possibilities. The formation of the ozone layer provided protection from harmful ultraviolet radiation, enabling life to inhabit shallower waters with greater safety. Nutrient flows between deep sea and surface layers created dynamic environments that encouraged diversification. In these enriched environments, early multicellular organisms flourished. They drifted, floated, and grazed on abundant microbial mats that covered vast areas of the seafloor. These mats, composed of cyanobacteria and other microbes, provided both food and structure, anchoring points where life could experiment with new forms. Some organisms began to grow larger, not through complex development, but simply by stacking cells or extending filament-like bodies outward. Size alone conferred advantages: better access to sunlight, resistance to being swept away by currents, and a reduced risk of predation. Though predators were still rare, then came the first tiny predators, simple, soft-bodied creatures capable of ingesting other cells. This single evolutionary innovation, predation, changed everything. For billions of years, life had existed without fear of being hunted. Suddenly, the oceans became battlegrounds. Survival was no longer guaranteed by merely floating and absorbing nutrients. Organisms now had to avoid being eaten. Natural selection intensified. Being larger, faster, or more durable became critical. Predation triggered a cascade of evolutionary responses. Some organisms developed tougher outer layers, forming rudimentary skins or protective mucus coatings. Others evolved the ability to move more deliberately, using cilia or muscular waves to propel themselves. Still others developed primitive sensory structures, capable of detecting chemicals or light changes that signaled approaching danger. These adaptations, small and incremental, collectively transformed early life from passive drifters into active participants in the struggle for existence. As evolutionary pressure mounted, Earth entered the Ediacaran period, roughly 635 to 541 million years ago. This era saw the rise of the first truly large and diverse multicellular organisms. The oceans now held creatures unlike anything before, or since. Some grew leaf-like bodies that absorbed nutrients directly from seawater. Others resembled soft discs lying flat on the seafloor. Still others took on tubular or frond-like shapes, swaying gently with ocean currents. These organisms formed the first complex ecosystems, occupying various niches and interacting with one another in ways previously impossible. Yet despite their intriguing forms, many Ediacaran creatures may not have been true animals. Their body plans were so unique that scientists still struggle to classify them. Some may represent extinct branches of life, experiments that evolution later abandoned. But hidden among them were the earliest ancestors of modern animals, simple worm-like organisms that dug through sediments, ingesting organic material and reshaping the ocean floor as they moved. Burrowing was more than a feeding strategy, it was an ecological revolution. By churning sediments, these early worms oxygenated the seafloor, releasing trapped nutrients and altering chemical gradients. The once stagnant ocean floor became livelier, encouraging new forms of life. Organisms adapted to the shifting sediments by developing firmer structures, improved mobility, and internal digestive systems to process food more efficiently. Inside these evolving bodies, cells began forming specialized tissues. Some tissues developed into muscles, enabling controlled movement. Others became digestive linings, allowing organisms to break down nutrients in internal cavities. Still others formed simple nervous systems, networks of connected cells capable of sending electrical impulses. The nervous system allowed organisms to coordinate movement, respond to stimuli, and explore their environments with greater precision. This shift toward complexity paved the way for bilateral symmetry, the idea that an organism could have a left side and a right side, a front and a back. Bilateral symmetry allowed for directional movement. An organism could identify a forward direction, concentrate sensory structures at the front, and push itself into new environments. This innovation, subtle but profound, laid the foundation for the body plans of most modern animals, from insects to humans. As Earth approached the dawn of the Cambrian period, several critical factors converged. Oxygen levels rose further, supporting larger and more active animals. Continental movements created shallow seas ideal for photosynthesis and nutrient cycling. Burrowing organisms enriched the seafloor. And evolutionary innovations, nervous systems, muscles, digestive tracts, and symmetry, prepared life for a dramatic expansion. Competition grew fiercer. Predators became more efficient, evolving simple jaws or sharp structures to pierce the bodies of their prey. In response, prey organisms developed thicker tissues, flexible bodies, or defensive shapes. These interactions created feedback loops of evolutionary pressure, each adaptation prompting new counter-adaptations. It was an arms race millions of years in the making. Then, around 541 million years ago, the tension broke. In an event known as the Cambrian explosion, life erupted into an astonishing diversity of forms. Body plans multiplied. Complex eyes evolved. Hard skeletons appeared for the first time. Movement became swift, purposeful, and varied. Animals swam, burrowed, crawled, and hunted with newfound efficiency, but this explosion was not an overnight miracle. It was the natural consequence of the long, quiet buildup that preceded it. The innovations of the Ediacaran and earlier eras, multicellularity, tissues, nervous systems, bilateral symmetry, predation, were stepping stones toward a world teeming with visible life. The Cambrian would make these innovations flourish, but the true groundwork had been laid in the silent depths of the Proterozoic oceans. By the end of this Precambrian age, life had achieved something extraordinary, the potential for complexity. Organisms were no longer simple clusters but coordinated systems. They could sense, respond, move, digest, and reproduce in sophisticated ways. They had become architects of their own evolution, shaping their environments as much as the environment shaped them. The world was ready. The oceans were ready. And life itself was ready. The next chapter would unleash forms and behaviors so diverse and dynamic that they would redefine the meaning of evolution. Earth was on the brink of becoming a planet not just inhabited by life, but transformed by it. For billions of years, Earth's oceans had been a realm of simplicity, silent, microscopic, and slow to change. Life had taken its time, building the cellular machinery, metabolic systems, and body plans necessary to support complexity. But around 541 million years ago, something extraordinary happened. In a geological instant, spanning perhaps 20 to 30 million years, life burst into dazzling diversity. This was the Cambrian explosion, a turning point so profound that it reshaped the future of biology forever. Before this event, the oceans were populated primarily by soft-bodied organisms. They drifted, grazed, or burrowed quietly. But during the Cambrian, nearly all major animal groups, arthropods, mollusks, chordates, echinoderms, annelids, appeared in recognizable form. The fossil record, once sparse, suddenly became crowded with shells, teeth, spines, eyes, and jaws. The seas were no longer still, they were alive with movement, conflict, and innovation. To understand why this explosion occurred, one must look at the conditions leading up to it. Oxygen levels had risen enough to support more energy-demanding organisms. Genetic innovations, including complex gene regulation and the development of the Hox genes, master switches that control body layout, provided the toolkit for biological experimentation. Predator-prey dynamics intensified, pushing evolution forward at unprecedented speed. And Earth's continents, climates, and oceans created new ecological niches waiting to be filled. Into this fertile world emerged creatures that would reshape the biosphere. The seafloor of the early Cambrian was a landscape bustling with life. Trilobites, one of the most iconic Cambrian organisms, scuttled across sediments in search of food. Their segmented, armored bodies provided protection from predators, while their jointed legs and compound eyes made them agile and alert. Trilobites diversified into hundreds of species, occupying niches as scavengers, predators, and filter feeders. Their fossils, abundant and well-preserved, offer a vivid snapshot of Cambrian life. Nearby, strange worm-like creatures tunneled through sediments, leaving winding tracks behind them. These burrows, preserved in rock, show evidence of active, intentional movement, behavior far more advanced than anything in the Ediacaran. Burrowing aerated the seafloor, mixed nutrients, and transformed the sediment layer into a lively, oxygen-rich habitat that supported even more diversity. Above the seafloor, the water column teemed with predators and prey. One of the most remarkable predators was Anomalocaris, a creature nearly a meter long, gigantic for its time. With flexible lobes along its body, it glided through water like a ribbon. Two spined appendages extended from its head, used to grasp prey. And at the center of its face was a circular mouth lined with hard plates capable of crushing shells. Anomalocaris represented something new, an apex predator, fast and efficient, driving evolutionary pressure throughout the marine ecosystem. Prey organisms responded in turn. Many developed shells or exoskeletons, the first hard parts in Earth's history. These shells came in all shapes and sizes: cones, spirals, plates, and domes. They provided vital protection in a world where being eaten was now a real possibility. Some organisms buried themselves in the sediment or adopted camouflaged body patterns. Others enhanced their mobility, evolving fins, flippers, or undulating muscles to escape faster predators. One of the most revolutionary innovations of the Cambrian was the eye. While simple light-sensitive cells had existed for eons, the Cambrians saw the emergence of complex, image-forming eyes. Trilobites possessed compound eyes made of numerous lenses, similar to those of modern insects. These eyes could detect motion, shape, and changes in light, giving trilobites a huge survival advantage. Once eyes became common, an evolutionary arms race began. Predators evolved sharper vision. Prey evolved better camouflage or harder shells. Vision transformed the interactions within ecosystems, fueling further bursts of innovation. Among the most intriguing Cambrian animals were the early chordates, ancestors of all vertebrates. These small, fish-like creatures possessed a notochord, a flexible rod that provided support and enabled efficient swimming. Though tiny and fragile, they represent the beginning of a lineage that would eventually lead to fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals. Their appearance marks one of the most remarkable transitions in life's history, the first steps toward complex nervous systems, true brains, and centralized control. As life expanded across the oceans, new ecological roles emerged. Filter feeders captured tiny particles from the water. Grazers scraped algae and microbial mats from rocks. Predators hunted actively. Scavengers cleaned up the remains of the fallen. This division of labor created stable ecosystems where energy flowed through food chains. Supporting increasingly complex interactions, meanwhile, the seafloor evolved into a three-dimensional landscape. Organisms built reefs, initially small and simple, but structurally significant. Sponges, early corals, and other skeletal organisms formed the foundation for these reef systems. Reefs created hiding places, feeding grounds, and breeding areas, further enriching biodiversity. For the first time, the ocean had architecture. The Cambrian explosion was not merely a burst of forms, it was a burst of possibility. Evolution began exploring nearly every conceivable body plan: creatures with long spines, creatures shaped like discs, creatures with armored plates, creatures that swam like arrows or crawled like armored tanks. Some of these designs thrived and left descendants that endure today. Others vanished, leaving only fossils as clues to their brief existence. One such enigmatic creature was Hallucigenia, a small, worm-like animal with spikes running along its back and tentacle-like legs along its underside. Its bizarre anatomy puzzled scientists for decades, as early reconstructions had placed it upside down. Today, we understand Hallucigenia as a member of the Lobopodians, an early group related to modern velvet worms and arthropods. Another oddity was Opabinia, a soft-bodied creature with 5 eyes and a long, flexible proboscis tipped with grasping claws. Its unique appearance defies comparison to any modern group, reminding us that evolution is a vast experiment, not all of which survives. Even simple organisms experience transformation. Sponges diversified, adopting new shapes and filtration strategies. Cnidarians, ancestors of jellyfish and corals, developed stinging cells to capture prey. Mollusks experimented with shells and muscular feet. Annelids refined their segmented bodies, allowing controlled movement and complex burrowing patterns. Throughout the Cambrian, life radiated outward, filling every available niche in the oceans. Competition and predation drove diversification. Environmental changes created opportunities and challenges. Gene networks, particularly the Hox genes, enabled organisms to modify body segments without disrupting overall function, leading to sophisticated designs. Yet despite its explosive diversity, the Cambrian era was still overwhelmingly marine. Land remained barren, silent, and hostile, a world of rock, sand, and wind without plants or animals. Life was confined to the oceans, where conditions were stable and resources abundant. But the foundation for terrestrial life was being laid in these waters. Structures like limbs, jaws, sensory organs, and complex nervous systems would later make it possible for creatures to venture onto land. The Cambrian explosion, though dramatic, did not last forever. By the end of the period, around 485 million years ago, many Cambrian creatures disappeared. Some were replaced by more advanced forms, others succumbed to environmental change. But the innovations of the Cambrian, skeletal structures, complex eyes, predation, body segmentation, chordate beginnings, endured. They shaped the course of evolution and set the stage for even more dramatic transformations in the Ordovician, Silurian, and Devonian periods. When we look at modern animals, from insects with compound eyes to fish with streamlined bodies, from mammals with intricate nervous systems to birds with complex limbs, we see echoes of Cambrian prototypes. The diversity of life on Earth today is, in many ways, a legacy of that ancient burst of creativity. The Cambrian period was the moment the world woke up. It was the time when life stepped out of simplicity and embraced complexity. When bodies became tools, senses became windows, and oceans became arenas of interaction. It marked the dawn of a dynamic, ever-evolving biosphere, a world that continues to change and innovate even today. The story of life would only grow more extraordinary from here. After the Cambrian, Earth would witness the rise of vast reefs, giant predators, the first land plants, and the first creatures to crawl onto the continents. The oceans, though still dominant, were no longer the only frontier. Life was preparing to conquer the land. A new chapter was waiting.